Hi. We are CEO now. A young architecture office here from Berlin. Young in the world of architecture means we just got started. A tough time getting started. But we can't complain. We have got projects. In Berlin. In the meta-urban circle of Berlin. Outside of Berlin. Near and far from Berlin. Originally no one of us is a Berliner. Like a lot of Berliners are originally no Berliners. We come from the Rhine. The Alps. The Balkans. But we all share a couple of years' experience in Berlin. In planning. In building. In researching. In teaching. In discussing. We can't be with you today, as we celebrate the marriage of 2 out of us 5 this weekend in Ireland. But we wanted to share some thoughts with you. Things we know about Berlin. Things we think we know about Berlin. Things we experienced. Things we observed. Things we think. First of all, we think it's important to know that Berlin is a polycentric city. That simply means that there is not one center but lots of them. This is already rooted in Berlin's foundation in the 12th century with the 2 neighboring cities Berlin and Köln. The one a settlement of Slavic fishermen. The other a trading city founded by Dutch and merchants from the Rhine. When the 2 entered a union, they picked an island in the River Spree that was only accessible from the bridge that connected the Berlin and Köln parts of the new city, as new site for their joint town hall. A kind of third space emerging. Until 1920, a lot of districts today considered typical Berlinish quarters were independent towns. Due to the emperor's fear of a red monster city, full with activist workers. The time of the newfound First Democratic German state was the earliest opportunity to establish this reform of a newly merged urban area called Gross Berlin. In English, Greater Berlin. As all of the components of Gross Berlin brought their very own specifics. Even after the bombardments at the end of World War II, the identity and the degree of urban independence of a district, such as Charlottenburg, was strong enough to derive the notion of West Berlin out of a spatial configuration that was no part of Berlin only 25 years ago. Facing Berlin's destruction, planners like Hans Schraun saw the opportunity to shift the rebuilding of the city towards a radical approach, based on the ideas of modernism and Cham particularly. Although for many reasons, mainly because of the early established division of Berlin, these plans were not implemented nearly as consequent as progressive modernists had wished for. Developments in both parts of Berlin, east and west, gave a new face to the one city of many cities. The auto-activity of the many specifics already existing never stopped being effective. Berlin continued to be many Berlins. The most obvious phenomena underlining this condition might be something that we call Doppeltes Berlin. The doubled Berlin. The ideological antagonism of the 2 systems clashing in Berlin lead to an architectural arms race, producing a twosomeness of building typologies. Not only creating some outstanding examples of Eastern and Western post-war architecture, but again numerous spaces of specificity. The opera was now part of the East, so they build a new one in the West. The East builds its vision of workers' palaces. The West answers with the Champions League of modernist architects. The West gives itself a new city center. The East recovers the historic core and invents the socialist city center. And so on. And so on. And so on. In a research and discourse project that had the luck to be featured in a prominent setup during the exhibition Between Walls and Windows, Architecture and Ideology a couple of years ago. We were successful in establishing the term of the double Berlin. But our suggestive proposal to merge the two again into a kind of third space as the town hall once was, symbolized by a new Berlin flag consisting of West and East Berlin's flag, might have been a little too late. After the reunification of Germany, the whole economy of the former German Democratic Republic GDR was in need of reforms, but instead pulped for the symbolic amount of just 1 Deutschmark. Literally junk dealers from the West took over factories with 5,000 workers. The outcome was a total collapse. And as West Berlin, a so-called showcase of the free world, was always only highly subsidized, all assembly lines were dismantled and taken back to the western sectors by the planes that supplied West Berlin with food during the time it was blocked by the GDR. So in the early 1990s Berlin was more or less a city without almost no producing industry, and even as designated new old capital without any headquarter of a single important company in a country that considers itself world champion of trade, while Mercedes-Benz, Sony, and others took initiative and established a new city center, right between the former West and the former East ones on Potsdamer Platz. For a long time known as Europe's biggest construction site. Potsdamer Platz and the partly new, partly refurbished government district stood flagship projects. The gold rush atmosphere that forced tons of dentists and pharmacists from the West to buy the ugliest rat holes with the promise of high profits in mind, was soon replaced by bitter disillusionment. All capital in Berlin's hands was the enormous amount of huge free space even in the most central districts of the town that had its origin in the bombardments of World War II as well as in its peripheral location close to the Berlin Wall. As West Berlin was a western island floating in a red sea of communism, it lacked attractiveness to those who wanted to make a career, but attracted others that tried to escape military service in West Germany, and who already established a counterculture. Cheap space added and newly reunified with East Berlin's not less lateral thinking subculture. Berlin became what looking backwards is often referred as a big laboratory of arts and culture. Others say the biggest techno club in the world. Lacking money of business tax, Berlin's mayor then, Klaus Wowereit, tried to make something out of nothing and invented the claim, Berlin, poor but sexy. At the same time as retrospective concepts of a Berlin as it once was before the 2 world wars. Still the idea of a colonist empire materialized in decisions as reconstructing the emperor's castle. At a spot that was now declared not only the center of a polycentric Berlin, but the center of whole Germany, Berlin's mayor started a development strategy, relying on money coming from outside the city as basis of its future development. The idea imagined a new bourgeoisie that would feel responsibly for Berlin and its development, and that would take the city's destiny into their own hands. Such ideologies of course mirror in architecture and town planning. As Berlin's creative image gained popularity all around the world, it didn't fail to attract people from all over the world as well. Statistics and numbers did completely fail in measuring what happened. Until 2012 the city's government still considered Berlin as a shrinking city, simply because they didn't realize that opposing a stereotyped German idea of bureaucracy, not every newly arrived took the first walk straight to the residence registration office. They didn't do it all. We don't need to talk about the G word. But its processes started more or less under the radar. As with such an biotope of low-end prizes, caused by the long division of the city, even after the first significant rises, Berlin didn't show up on the list of highly expensive cities, such as Munich or Düsseldorf. Not to mention a worldwide comparison with London, Paris or New York. That the city marketing was seeking itself for a long time. These processes in Berlin happen extremely accelerated. And while gaps between buildings, Baygruppen and urban farming were the discourse's keywords until perceived yesterday. Interesting why is the use of unrenovated buildings as clubs, bars and whatever, the improvised appropriation of space, lead to an aesthetically phenomenon that we would call Berlin style. Pulled down wallpapers, naked concrete, industrial materials, furniture from GDR times. The Berlin-based architecture critic Florian Halmier tried at the beginnings of the 2010s to establish the term Raumrolling, roughly translated as blank space. But while examples that try to deal with this kind of aesthetics, such as the studio building by Brandlüber Plus in Brunnenstrasse, we've all been working there as young architects for quite a long time, tried to use this notion to establish a new architecture that would lower the standards of surfaces, but therefore keep the quality of spatial freedom as found in Berlin. It turned out that all the building gaps, all the huge spaces in the city were already sold and not reachable for the target group of an emerging Berlin culture. Whatever that means. Any longer. Even worse, the city itself privatized almost all of its hidden reserves and sold properties with unbelievable bad deals. Bad deals. Sad. Very sad. We experienced this in a proposal together with the Brandlüber office, when suggesting the reuse of 3-story basement ruin of a sports hotel. A leftover from the first Berlin gold rush and owned by the city, as the museum of contemporary art that the city was longing for a long time and only asked for a temporary solution, as there was simply no money for a permanent one. As enthusiasm for the proposal began to rise, it turned out that the city sold the site to an investor for only a third of its worth. Even more worse, around 2012 Berlin realized that far more people came and keep coming to Berlin without the mandatory visit of the residence registration office, and that Berlin was not shrinking but instead growing. It turned out that Berlin was heavily lacking flats, and people recognizing the increase of their rents become extremely nervous and considering the option of arming themselves with residential property. In 2013 and 2014 we accompanied a group of people that got liquid with money they inherited and that wanted to build flats for themselves, but to use the rest of the money to finance subsidized housing for less liquid people. The housing project finally should have been turned into a cooperative, so that after the 20 years of price maintenance for the rent, it would be secure that there will be no alignment to the exploding prices on the free market. It proved impossible to find a site for 40 flats on the free market. So the group decided to shift its concept into an even more social agenda by integrating flats for various groups under social pressure. The project, now known under the name Model Plus, in search of public properties, experienced in surprising and enthusiastic echo. Even more where the finance model was convincing and prepared for eventualities. We meet politicians from all parties, except the right-wingers. Everyone was patting the group on the back. We were sent one hierarchical level up by each until we sat with the mayor. Patting backs. Appreciative words. The suggestion not to talk too much about financial models, but to provide an image instead. No space. So here we are into politics. And Berlin is not short of political grassroots organizations that try to influence the city's development. For a while, for example, Kotti & Co., a movement by the people inhabiting the area around Cottbusser Tor in Kreuzberg, gave this group a recognizable face and was conspicuous because of the fact that it was an heterogeneous group that included people who are normally spoken for. This year the new Berlin city government, in a highly symbolic effort, bought the famous residential complex at Cottbusser Tor back from investors. Another example is Tempelhofer Feld. The referendum held under the Berlin citizens brought a law that now forbids it to build anything at all on the former inner city airport. While the activists behind this suggestion are sometimes referred to as hippies that just wanted to save their raised bed gardens, the driving force behind this obstacle was that there was simply no trust any longer in the city's development politics. That already imagined projects on the airfield showed only little desire to provide something new and progressive. This led to the paradox situation of the red card shown to the city government. But on the other hand, where space is urgently needed, not even progressive concepts will now find any home here. For a long time there has been made an exception, as refugees were housed in the former airport and in temporary shelters on the airfield. Now Berlin's famous Volksbahn is going to host events there. But that's another story and we do not have that much time. In the 2015 book The Dialogic City, that was an outcome of the works that students from Academy of Fine Arts in Nuremberg did over a time span of 2 years, and that featured various prominent figures of Berlin's city development. Beside other things, there were tender suggestions of how architects or town planners could start to take influence on laws as a toolkit of the topics that they are concerned with. One example was the suggestion to allow one story on top of a building more, if therefore one story in the building is rented out for the price of 6,50 per square meter, which is the rent that is asked for on the Berlin subsidized market. The Dialogic City led to a project called Legislating Architecture, gathering positions from all over the world on how law and architecture interact. This field starts with very simple relationships, such as how rules like spacing arrangements shape the appearance of buildings. It shows strategies of how architecture makes use of regulations, and how architecture infiltrates regulations. It gives an explanation why certain things look like how they look like. But from being co-editor of the ARCH Plus issue of the same title, one could say, when it comes to the point of how architects and town planners could use the legislating processes to respond to the problems and topics they are concerned with, it becomes clear that there is already a high complexity of decision procedures going on, that the elected representatives are as well already aware of. One example is the coupling of two problems that Berlin, just like other German cities, have to deal with at the moment. The immense lack of living space as outcome of not being concerned with the market for the last 2 decades, and the decision not to support subsidized housing at all for almost the same time. Plus, now Berlin has to house roughly 80,000 refugees. In the ARCH Plus issue, then Permanent Secretary for Building and Housing in the Berlin Senate Department for Urban Development and the Environment, disclosed the idea of pioneer housing, suggesting that, for example, the famous German energy-saving regulations that lead to insulations up to 60 centimeters could be lowered or even overridden for refugee housing. Deriving from Section 246, the refugee paragraph of the German Building Code. He said, "Okay. Let's imagine a planned neighborhood with a few thousand apartments. You can lay down the initial building block inside a year. Thanks to modular construction and to accelerated building permit in line with Section 246 of the Building Code. And because the refugees, who meanwhile have become citizens of Berlin, want to improve their living conditions, we keep adding to the urban development of the neighborhood. Step by step, we keep adding more urban building blocks, built as entirely normal, conventional, standardized housing. Then after 2018, the original refugee housing and the new buildings can gradually be occupied by a mix of residents. And this would generate a social mix in both the new neighborhood and the district as a whole. The idea certainly has some charm. Let's call it pioneer housing. But it's impossible to judge today with any certainty if this model of setting refugees will truly work, or if it just stems from a romantic notion of egalitarianism. As referred earlier, Berlin has a new government now. The Senate Department for Urban Development was taken over by the Left Party that campaigned with the slogan, "The left, and the city is yours." But Senator Catherine Lompscher also said that this claim cannot count that way any longer for all city areas inside the S-Bahn ring. She considers this areas as lost and sold and concentrates on the areas outside the ring. The new government is in charge since last December, and flagship projects like the rebuying of the housing complex at Cottbusser, the stop of a settlement because of its lacking public transportation, while other cities still haven't learned this lesson, or the nomination of gentrification expert Andrich Hohn as secretary. Even though he had to leave after only a few weeks because of the pressure from the conservative inventory concerned about his past as young guardsman in the GDR, are encouraging. But the para-urban is not a reservoir for a growing urbanity or a wave-like ranging urbanity. It's a spatial configuration with rules beside legislative codifications and behind illegible symbols. The question if the urban is transplantable and if there is a need for a transplantation at all, comes simultaneously with actual and urgent questions of detail. Only one look at the mappings Leipzig-based architect and researcher Eugenia Freund did on Berlin illustrates the equality of mindsets that think Berlin without a hierarchy of any urban degree. Not to talk about the permeability between Berlin and Potsdam, Berlin and Brandenburg in general, and the interconnectivity that comes via other ways. Completely other agents define the course of events. Other typologies define the circumstances under which lifestyles clash. And not least this becomes visible in the vis-à-vis of detached housing, auto centers, large developments, biotech, meditech, and the absence of public transportation. Things and action that belong to the idea of an urban center. And things and action that we now are about to define as the para-urban. What is urban anyway? Are the para-urbanists resistant towards the problems of the urban center? Or will they collapse like sensible biotopes? The field of architecture and town planning will in any case have to take its own agency. In our own practice we experienced a shift of commissions from inner ring to outer parts of the city and the countryside in Brandenburg and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, by concentrating onto the city center. That a polycentric city cannot have anyway. We lost sight of the other parts of city. And now we have to find out that the processes are not radiating from the middle. They follow other logics. Districts like, for example, Marzahn are quite different from the stereotypes that accompany their name. Where we are working in the district of Berlin-Buchenau, we, not knowing a thing about there, had to find out that there are thousands of jobs in the field of medical and biotechnology. Whole settlements where former citizens of Prenzlauer try to live their vision of a green urbanity. Centers that are almost not readable but there for centuries. Fair enough. But are this not the areas that were supposed to house those who cannot be in the center any longer? And where, as in the case of our client, do social organizations go to when they are not able to afford the rents in inner city for basic offers as youth welfare? Everywhere we go, people take agency for politics, for economy, for their own private interest. If we want to influence things in a positive way, architects and town planners will also have to take agency for the concerns we observe. If we do not suggest laws ourselves, the least thing we can do is to criticize them. Architecture and town planning can support certain processes and at least not make things impossible. But beyond aesthetics and good planning, we will have to organize and talk. And we will have to observe and understand. Like you will do in the next days in the grid square this summer school is focused on. We would wish we could be personally with you today, and we are looking forward to hear about your outcomes soon. Have a good time, you all. If there's anything that you want to say, that you want to share with us, contact us. team@gonow.eu